Well, hi everybody. I am Wendy Silman, the Director of Education for the Santa Rosa Symphony, and thank you for joining us tonight. The Santa Rosa Symphony Institute for Music Education offers more than a dozen programs throughout Sonoma County, and we are proud that we have continued to offer every one of them this past year. To learn more about our programs, please visit our website, srsymphony.org. And if you are between the ages of 5 and 23, join us because we have a place for you. Some of our programs, like the Young People's Chamber Orchestra, have met weekly in person following health and safety protocols. And we are grateful to the Saturday Afternoon Club in Santa Rosa and the Phoenix Theater in Petaluma for helping to make that possible. We thank the sponsor of this season's YPCO, Gregory Spren, and we also thank the parents and the teachers who encouraged our young musicians, as well as the musicians themselves for showing up and working hard. I want to acknowledge our wonderful orchestra managers, Matt Payne, Kate Matwichik, and Elena Sloman, who have just now pulled off an amazing feat getting this off the ground, so congratulations. I also want to thank our wonderful recording engineer, Enrique Rojas, and Aaron Westman, and our videographer, Jurgita Mezeka. We are delighted to share with you the culmination of a partnership that began last August with Andrew Carruthers, resulting in the spectacular Redwood Violin you will hear tonight. Also on tonight's program is a guest appearance by a vocal advocate for music education, the music director of the Santa Rosa Symphony, Maestro Francesco Lecce Chong. We are grateful for his leadership. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the guiding light and the creative talent behind tonight's program, the director of Young People's Chamber Orchestra, Aaron Westman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's so exciting to be at the end of our season, a very strange season indeed. I've been calling this the pandemic farewell concert for YPCO, but officially it's called Underrepresented but Great. Here we are in May of 2021. The last live concerts that I participated in were February 28th and 29th of 2020, 15 months ago. The concert on the 29th was YPCO's season finale at the Phoenix Theater in Petaluma. Little did any of us know back then that everything for at least the next 15 months would be some version of what you're about to see tonight. That is an online streaming format with, part or all of it pre-recorded, to hopefully to help us avoid some technical glitches, although we still do end up having them almost every time. Anyway, fortunately, it's starting to seem like things are getting better and we won't have to do this anymore. So, but we decided let's try to make the most out of an unusual situation that nobody really knew our way out of. And I planned from the beginning of the season to do a recording project. Originally, it was going to be an audio recording project. And what it's turned into was actually kind of a really cool event to produce videos of some of the music, a sampling of some of the music that we've worked on this season on our program, Underrepresented But Great. We recorded the music back in April, and we've spent the last month producing them to make them look really as nice as possible. And we're going to share them with you tonight. So let me tell you just a little bit about the concept of the program because it's important. In order to do that, I'm going to start out with a very brief primer on concert programming. That is the art of selecting music for a concert or a whole season of concerts, which involves a tricky balance between basically three different categories of music. Category one, you've got music that the audience and the musicians all know and love. Sometimes people call this the canon, the musical canon. Category two is music that the audience doesn't know, but if only you heard it, you might just fall in love with it. And category three is music that the audience doesn't know and probably won't love right away, but that might challenge you to open up your ears and minds a little bit. And we won't really go into that category tonight, but let's think of it as like an acquired taste. So if you're a big arts organization, you've got a significant budget on the line for each concert or each performance, um, it can really seem quite risky to stray away from category one, the chestnuts. Most of those pieces are written, pretty much all of those pieces are written by dead white men. These are composers like Bach, Vivaldi, Handel, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Verdi. That's not all of them, that's just a sampling. Um, and Even though it seems like there's a lot of music in that category, it's really just a tiny fraction of the music that's ever been written. Now, most of the music in this category is truly great and well deserving of its status being canonized or being in that first category. Now, the problem is our entire classical music institution, from education on up to the arts presenters, the opera companies, and orchestras, is built around this concept of the musical canon, of pieces that are guaranteed to sell tickets and please the patrons and do very little to challenge the thinking and comfort of the listener. But there is a very large category of music that is just as good or potentially pleasing to the audience that never makes it into that first category for one reason or another. These works make up that second category. You might ask, if they're so great, then why don't they make it into the canon? Well, perhaps it's because the composer was a woman and was shut out of the educational and professional institutions that enable name recognition and canonization. Perhaps it's because they're a person of color and they faced societal discrimination and didn't have access to institutional support in the first place. And perhaps it's just because they're from a place like Stockholm, Sweden, which isn't exactly a major musical center like Vienna, Venice, London, or Leipzig. Or maybe it's just because their name has been so overshadowed by the greatness of the greats that the perception came about that they must be lesser or somehow imperfect. When we ignore this category, we miss out on a whole lot of amazing music and so many voices and perspectives that are different from what we were accustomed to. So, having heard this now, hopefully y'all are saying to yourself, wouldn't it be interesting to hear a whole concert of music by people whose names I've never heard? If I know that that music is really good and probably I'll like it or find it interesting. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I usually include one composer at least, or one piece that's recognizable. And tonight that person is Scott Joplin, a Black American composer about whom you'll hear in just a minute from our principal second violinist, Claire. But if you're already a Joplin fan, you may not know his Magnetic Rag, which is his last published composition and the piece that we'll be playing. And you probably don't know much about the remaining composers on the program. As it so happens, in particular this past season, you may have heard a couple of these other names if you've been watching the SRS at home productions. And that's because Francesco Lecce Chong, the music director of the Santa Rosa Symphony, has a similar attitude to programming, and especially because of the pandemic restrictions, he's been sort of forced to program chamber orchestra repertoire instead of the larger symphonic repertoire that requires the full orchestra. And that's exactly the same category that the Young People's Chamber Orchestra is in, chamber orchestra. So we are a bit more in alignment than during any normal season. In fact, when I first met Francesco at a YPCO rehearsal last January, we were rehearsing a piece by Carolyn Shaw, a wonderful composer whom I've personally worked with a number of times and who is an amazing, living, female Pulitzer and Grammy-winning composer who is just tearing it up right now. And Francesco told me that he had just programmed the same piece to do during the 2020 and 2021 season, 2020 to 21 season with the Symphony. And indeed, it was just on their set 7, a wonderful piece called Entr'acte. And a few months later, when we were discussing the YPCO season and the potential for him to join us on something, I mentioned another female composer, an Austrian-Spanish classical composer named Marianne Martinez, who has a fascinating story that you will soon hear about. And the next thing I hear, we'd programmed the same piece. Without knowing it. So when Francesco and I were discussing how he could be involved with the season, we decided that would be the piece for him to join us on. So he joins us playing harpsichord continuo on the Sinfonia in C major by Marianne Martinez. So we have that to look forward to a little later in the program. And of course, as Wendy mentioned, we have the much awaited premiere of the Redwood Violin, which is the kickoff of the played local phase of the Santa Rosa based violin maker Andrew Carruthers' fantastic and highly unusual project. Andy has made a little summary video of his project for us to play during the concert tonight. And he and I also recorded a short discussion, which we will play as well before the premiere. The piece that is the premiere of the Redwood Violin is called Concertina for Violin and Strings by our very own Gwendolyn Przyjazna. Gwen is 17 years old, a wonderful cellist, and an inspired and thoughtful young composer. I'm really excited to hear that piece. Tonight we have music by 2 Black American composers, a Black composer from England, 2 female composers, and a composer from Stockholm, Sweden, whose name I'm quite sure you've never heard, even if you're an 18th century music nerd like me. So we very much hope that you enjoy this evening's program, that it will open your ears to something new, and also hear a little about some less than familiar composers, starting with a piece by a composer whose name you probably have heard. So I'm going to turn things over now to Claire Wu, our principal second violinist, who's going to introduce Scott Joplin and our first piece of the evening.
Ladies and gents, my name is Claire, and first up in tonight's program is a piece named Magnetic Rag, composed by the king of ragtime, Scott Joplin. An African-American composer, pianist, vocalist, and cornetist born in the United States in the 1860s, Scott Joplin once attended Sedalia's George R. Smith College for Negroes. But as a teenager, Joplin played in bars and halls, where predecessors of ragtime music were played. Ragtime, which came before jazz, is known for its syncopated rhythms and was first created by African Americans, so some white critics looked down upon the type of music in Joplin's time. But in 1899, Scott Joplin succeeded in publishing the most popular instrumental ragtime song, the Maple Leaf Rag, a piece of sheet music which was the first to sell over 1 million copies. Despite really wanting to be taken seriously as a composer of opera and serious art music, though, an opera that Joplin wrote in 1911 named Treemonisha was never performed during Joplin's lifetime. In fact, his music was underappreciated until the early 1970s, when the pianist and harpsichordist Joshua Rifkin recorded a very successful album of Joplin works, and the premiere of Treemonisha took place in 1972. So Joplin's work became more well-known, and in 1973, the soundtrack to the movie The Sting even included several Joplin works too, including The Entertainer. Today, however, we will be listening to and spotlighting Joplin's less famous composition, Magnetic Rag, originally composed by Scott Joplin and published in 1914 for the piano. It is the last ragtime composition that Joplin ever published and expresses a sorrowful mood that Joplin rarely had in his other works, which may have reflected his own feelings for living with syphilis while he wrote the piece before dying in 1917. However, I like Magnetic Rag because of the jovial tune that is repeated throughout the piece. So it seems that this ragtime piece is a song full of contrasts. Enjoy YPCO's performance of Scott Joplin's Magnetic Rag.
Hello, everyone. My name is Miranda. I just want to say real quick, thank you to our wonderful staff for putting together that wonderful video. It was great to see all our work come together in that. I will be introducing our next piece, which is by Johan Helmich Roman, who was a Swedish Baroque composer, and he was not so well known, but if he is known, he's most well known for being the leader of the Swedish opera during its Age of Liberty. He was born in Stockholm in 1694, and historians believe that he first started receiving his musical lessons from his father, who was the Swedish Royal Chapel, a member of that. And so that's where Roman was first introduced to music, and then was also able to begin playing the violin and the oboe. And so he joined that in 1711, and then he would later move on to go to London and study abroad for 6 years, where he worked under different composers, and particularly one Category 1 composer, which you all probably know as Handel, which you can see his influence in some of Roman's earlier pieces, but he later obviously developed his own style. And so he then returned to Sweden, where he eventually became chief master of the Swedish Royal Orchestra. and during which that time he greatly improved the standards of the Royal Chapel and also opened a lot of the first Swedish public concerts, if you will. And then unfortunately he had a pretty successful career, but then his main patron, the Queen, passed, and then he began to suffer from health problems, which decreased the speed at which he was able to produce pieces and work. So all these things compiled led to sort of unfortunate end to a wonderful career. And on top of that, the new prince and his wife, after Roman composed a wonderful piece for their wedding, ended up making a new chapel with a new orchestra and a new composer because the princess had a different taste in music. So that was quite unfortunate for him. But we were able to bring into fruition one of his wonderful pieces, the Sinfonia in E minor, which he wrote around 1750. And it offers a big range of emotions and characters that are displayed throughout the different movements. And I think it's just a wonderful piece to play. It's very exciting. It's a great uplifting kind of fun piece to play in between recordings. And it was just a great thing to bring us all together, as most of the pieces on this program are. And it's a great example of his style, and it showcases each section really lovely. So I hope you guys enjoy the performance of Sinfonia in E minor just as much as we enjoyed playing it. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Wow, it was so lovely to see all our work come to fruition. And thank you so much for the people who put all the hard work into making this concert happen. Our next piece is Sinfonia in C major, composed in 1770 by 26-year-old Marianne Martinez, an Austrian aristocrat of Spanish descent. Martinez was a singer, composer, and pianist living in Vienna during the classical period. Her family's large house in Vienna was also home to several notable tenants: Joseph Haydn, Nicola Porpora, who was Haydn's and Martinez's teacher, and the famous poet Pietro Metastasio, who was extremely close with the Martinez family and lived with them for nearly 50 years. She also crossed paths with Mozart, with whom she shared a teacher in common, and you can hear some of the similarities in their work. Sinfonia in C major is one of the first known classical symphonies written by a woman and has 3 movements. Martinez is one of the forgotten female composers who is well regarded and known during her day, but has mostly been written out of the history books. I was taken by the character and the upbeat personality of the piece, and it was unusual and refreshing to work together on a piece that was written by a woman. So I hope you enjoy.
Hi, my name is Julian Luciano, and this is my first year playing in YPCO. In the age of the pandemic, it really meant a lot to me to have a weekly social gathering with my fellow musicians, and I want to thank Aaron and Elena and others for making that possible. Next up is Mother and Child by William Grant Still. Still was an African-American classical composer who wrote more than 150 compositions. He was the first African-American to conduct a major American symphony orchestra, the first to have a symphony performed by a leading orchestra, the first to have an opera performed by a major opera company, and the first to have an opera performed on national television. He is often referred to as the Dean of African American Composers. Although his abilities as a performer and arranger led to many opportunities for him beyond the concert hall, he was inspired by the career of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor to become a composer of concert and music opera. Still grew up in Little Rock and started violin lessons at the age of 15. He taught himself to play the clarinet, saxophone, oboe, double bass, cello, and viola, and showed great interest in music. His maternal grandmother sang African American spirituals to him. At only the age of 16, he graduated from N.W. Gibbs High School in Little Rock. Still achieved numerous firsts for Black American composers, along with multiple honorary doctorates and abundant commissions. These accomplishments were all hard-won, however, and his life and career were enmeshed in the complex racial and cultural politics of his time. The composer's daughter, Judith Ann, relates that the lovely Mother and Child, written in 1943, appeared initially as the second movement of the composer's suite for violin and piano, adding that this work was a favorite of her father's, as well as countless music lovers. Here, the composer drew inspiration from a lithograph by Sergeant Johnson. The composition quickly gained increased popularity. The composer said that Mother and Child reminded him of his much-loved mother. The music is a detailed portrait of his mother's sweetness, balanced by her rigorous appraisal for proper behavior, creating a double-edged balance between lullaby and insistence that make major and minor key tonalities. Personally, I feel very tranquil when playing this piece. I enjoy playing it because of the emotion it conveys. I feel a story in the music that develops as it goes on. I hope you enjoy the piece.
My name is Andrew Carruthers, and I've been a violin maker for over 30 years. Recently, I wondered what it would be like to make a violin from scratch using only materials that came from within 25 miles of my house. I made the violin, and everything on it, apart from the strings and a couple of metal parts, actually grew out of the ground in Sonoma County. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of the violin, and you'll see that not only were a lot of local people involved in making it, but the materials that I chose have a cultural significance to the community. The redwood top comes from the logging industry that was a cornerstone of the economy of Sonoma County and the Redwood Empire in the mid-19th century. Part of our county was literally and figuratively built of redwood. This piece of old-growth redwood was very light and evenly grained and quite suitable as a tone wood. When I'd finished carving it down to where it gave me the right ring tone, it was still 40% thicker than it would have been if I'd been using my usual Italian spruce. The back, sides, and neck of the violin started life in one of Sebastopol's apple orchards. The apple industry here blossomed in the mid-1800s and peaked in the 1940s. Fruit woods like apple are traditional carving woods, and it was a real pleasure to work for the back and scroll. It also bent like a dream for the sides of the violin. I didn't do all of the work on the violin myself. If there was someone local who knew more about doing something than I did, I'd ask for help. The inlay on the back was done by my friends Greg Zool and Mark Tindley, who are marquetry specialists. For an emblem, we decided on a tiger salamander, which is a local endangered species. And there she is, wandering across the back and treading on some fallen leaves from one of our iconic valley oaks. The tuning pegs for the violin were made by local woodturner Kalia Kleban. Kalia really dove into the project and made some great looking pegs out of local manzanita. Sometimes it seemed that the smaller the part, the more people were involved in making it. The label inside the violin was made by papermaker Jane Ingram Allen and calligrapher Sherry Lovler. And I provided the ink that I made from the hulls of California black walnuts growing in my backyard. The striped purfling inlay on the back and the top of the violin was made from wood shavings dyed black using a local mushroom, iron, and tannin from acorns. I already had some previous experience of making instruments out of unusual woods, but there were parts of this project that were a real exploration for me. I made a traditional protein glue from the tendons of local beef. It took a few tries and some experimenting, but eventually I came up with something that worked really quite well. Another new venture was making the traditional tail gut. I obtained the intestines of a local sheep, cleaned them, and twisted them into a tail gut. Making the varnish for the violin started with collecting pine sap, which I melted to extract turpentine and resin, and I recombined them and mixed them with walnut oil that I pressed from locally grown walnuts. Once the violin was complete, I took it down to my friend Mick Loveland, who owns the local violin shop, and he made a bridge for it. The bridge was made of Pacific madrone. And here it is, the Redwood Violin, a very local version of a very traditional instrument. It's a beautiful thing, but the most interesting thing about it is that it's a tool for making music. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the next part of this project, Played Local, where I'll be loaning the instrument out to musicians in the community who will make all kinds of music.
So here it is. Here we are. It's May of 2021. We're well into the vaccine era of the strange pandemic year.
No masks.
No masks. Yes, right. When we met just a few feet away from here last summer for the first time, and you first brought up this concept of building a violin from completely locally sourced materials. It just blew my mind. But of course, we were wearing masks, and it was a very different world from what we're living in now. What are kind of the morals of the story for you over the last year working on this project?
Well, it was a very different thing to what I normally do. And primarily, the main difference was that I wanted to involve as many people as I could in the project. I mean, normally I work by myself. I'm not very engaged with the community because my market for my instruments tends to be other parts of the country. So I really did want to include as many people as I could. I didn't know whether people would do it, but it seemed to be an idea that people liked. So including other craftspeople, that was great for me. But a real revelation, or a great thing, was when I realized musicians were interested as well and would like to take it up. There was a major step when I went from instead of just making it, I could actually follow the thing being played locally as well, and that was the point at which I thought, well, that could be some kind of a thread that might pull various artists together.
You've entrusted the Young People's Chamber Orchestra to the premiere of the Redwood Violin, which is we were very honored to be a part of the project in such an important way. So the theme of our concert is underrepresented composers, and that is composers who have been sort of left out of the canon of musical perfection that we learn about in school, or that we hear over and over again recycled by major arts organizations. Yeah. But I feel like both in the music business, and perhaps you can speak to this in the violin business as well, this idea of perfection really blinds us to the variety that is out there in the world. And so many things that can inspire us and can be important to us. So can you talk a little bit about this concept of sourcing materials locally, and why that's not normal in the traditional violin making business? Right.
Yeah. So in violin making, very traditional, is an instrument that evolves slowly, and that at a certain point got to a pinnacle of evolution.
So to put a point on that.
Yeah.
The violin wasn't invented at one particular point in time.
Right.
There's historians and musicologists have never been able to set a date on the invention of the violin, because it evolved from
other things,
a variety of other things, and it was a very sophisticated string instrument building business already,
right.
sourcing materials
Right.
from wherever they could get them that
That's
was
right.
the best quality.
Right. It had been learned what kind of woods work best, and if you didn't want to take a risk, you were going to use those woods. We tend to use a very narrow range of materials because we think those work the best.
And copy, very specific models.
Copy
of
very
violins.
to very small tolerances. But if you do change the ingredients, you do get slightly
Different results.
slightly different results. Yeah, and even if you don't change the ingredients, you get different results anyway, just within a narrower range.
Yeah. So the precedent for making a violin out of just entirely local materials down to the pine sap that you make the varnish out of, and the dyes that from local things, and all the wood, various woods, and that's really not ever been a major part of fine violin building.
I mean, I hate to say that anything's new in violin making, because as soon as you say that, someone gives you an example.
Someone will be like, "Well, hey,"
because there's been so much violin making over the centuries.
But
it's very unusual, and it's not a practical thing to do.
So to just get back to this concept of perfection and how it blinds us to the variety that's out there, and the YPCO program that we're listening to right now features composers who've been left out of this canon for one reason or another, whether they're a person of color who through discrimination and just being sort of shut out of the channels that elevate music to this level of being included in the canon of music that's recycled and repeated over and over and over again by musical groups and by big arts organizations. So discrimination, whether they're a person of color, a woman, or just because they come from a place that's not Vienna or London or New York or sort of a major musical center, or because their name isn't well known. And I notice even in myself, if somebody mentions a piece and I haven't heard of the composer, I'm like, or even if it's a famous composer, even just Bach, but I didn't know the specific piece, I might be like, well, there's a part of me that wants to say I haven't heard of it because it must not be as good. Is there a parallel in violin making?
Yeah, I mean, we do tend to narrow down to a few makers that we say, this is the pinnacle that could be achieved. But the thing about it is that, I mean, perfection, it doesn't really apply, because you're always with music, you're always talking about taste. I mean, it's subjective what one person finds, perfect or the best or whatever. I mean, part of it is that the technology changed and the music changed to match the technology. I mean, by technology, I mean what the instruments could do.
And with every little incremental change you make on an instrument to improve projection or to improve the action or the ability to speak clearly or quickly, you lose something else. It's always a trade-off.
Yeah.
And that's part of the mentality that gets us into trouble with this idea of there's perfection, we've reached perfection, there's nothing better, everything else must be imperfect.
Right. I think there might be something else going on with instruments, which is the price of them. And it's come to the point where look for an instrument that's good generalist, really.
Right.
And I've been talking to my neighbor next door who has 30 guitars. And he says, I love this guitar for this, and I love this guitar for that. Right. And in the violin world, you can't do it because
they're too expensive.
They're too expensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nobody's going to come to me to say, can you make a violin that really shrieks, because I got this piece that, it's just got that feeling to it, And then, the next day they're going to say, I want something that's just going to melt people's hearts, and, oh yeah, I'll make that. But no, they need one instrument that's going to do everything.
That's going to do everything. When we first discussed this, you were concerned about how the violin would sound in the end.
Yeah.
Not, of course, having been through this process yet and having explored the exactly what kind of walnut and what type of what Malbec grapes would look like in varnish. So how did the results turn out? How did that surprise you?
Well, yeah, I was a little nervous because I didn't know the ingredients. I'd made my best guess about what I thought I could get locally, the best match what I was used to using, and I was hoping that it would be at least as good as what most, because it's going to be donated to the youth orchestra. I was hoping it would be at least as good as the instruments that the players in the orchestra were using. And anyway, I was pleasantly surprised that it actually sounded really, I'd say, on a par with my other instruments.
It's amazing.
Which is, they're as good as I can make them.
It was a great honor to be one of the first people to play the instrument and to be a part of this project as a whole. I never before considered what went into making a violin or all of the artisans and unique materials that constitute the final product. I think Mr. Carruthers' decision to have the violin debut in a youth ensemble was both fitting and true to the homegrown theme of the project. Sonoma County has such a robust array of opportunities for young people to receive musical education, something that I have been lucky enough to experience firsthand. I'd like to thank Andrew Carruthers for this opportunity, as well as Aaron and everyone else in YPCO. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gwendolyn Przyjazna. I wrote the piece you're about to hear, Concertina for Violin and Strings. I originally wrote the piece back in April of 2020. The onset of the COVID pandemic about a month before had left me feeling shocked, afraid, and sad. Then I woke up one morning and heard this melody in my head that seemed to come from a brighter place, a more hopeful place. Later that spring, I shared some of my compositions with our director, Aaron Westman. Of those, he told me he particularly liked this one and offered to add it to the concert program. I had originally intended the work for viola and piano. Aaron made the suggestion that I arrange it for solo violin and the rest of the ensemble. Later, I was thrilled to learn that the piece would be used to premiere the Redwood Violin. The first time the YPCO read my piece, I was astonished. Up until then, my music had only been played by myself or digitally rendered. It was exhilarating and refreshing to join other musicians in playing my piece, so this premiere is a very special moment for me. Please enjoy Concertina for Violin and Strings.
My name is Sebastian Luciano, and I've been playing the viola for 5 years. This is my first year playing with the YPCO along with my brother, and I enjoyed it very much. Samuel Coleridge-Taylor was an English composer, conductor, and political activist who fought against race prejudice with his incredible compositions. Born in Holborn in 1875 to an English mother and his father originally from Sierra Leone, he liked to be identified as an Anglo-African and was later referred by white New York musicians by Black Mahler, owing to his musical success. His name was given to him after the famous poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who, curiously, became a great source of inspiration during his career. Raised in a family of keen musicians, Taylor's father taught him to play the violin at a young age. The boy's talent and affinity towards music was obvious, so he was encouraged to join the Royal College of Music when he was just 15 years old, and it was here that he perfected his technique. Soon enough, Taylor began writing compositions under the guidance of Professor Charles Stanford, and after completing his degree, his career as a composer went from strength to strength. Conscious of his African descent, Taylor's classical compositions were heavily influenced by traditional African music, and this made him one of the most progressive writers of his time. Despite the Black community's ongoing battle against racism, the first part of this work, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, was so popular that it led him to embark on 3 tours of the United States. In fact, his work across music and politics was so well received that in 1904, he was even invited by President Theodore Roosevelt to visit the White House, a bold statement and a positive step forward for African Americans. Samuel Coleridge-Taylor died of pneumonia on September 1st, 1912, in Croydon, at the age of 37. Throughout his short life, he faced financial struggles and personal tragedy, which are both often linked to his early demise. Last but not least, this song that you will be hearing is a scherzo called Humoresque, which seems to have a vague bohemian aura to it and playful cross rhythms. It serves as the third piece of the Fantasy Pieces, or Fantasiestücke, for string quartet, OP5, composed by Samuel Coleridge-Taylor in 1895 while he was still a student at the Royal College. This song was upbeat and a pleasure to play. Whenever I hear it, it feels like I am on an adventure with lots of dancing and laughing. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do.
thank you all so much for joining us on this journey exploring some wonderful music by less well-known names. And we couldn't have done this project without the help of a number of people. I want to thank a few of them now. These are people who have really directly made it possible for us to meet most weeks during the season in person and to produce the program that we're about to conclude with, that we just finished. For the last 5 seasons, Matt Payne was our YPCO manager. More than anyone else, Matt helped create a culture, a thriving culture that put YPCO on the map and on a path to being a vital part of our education program here at the Santa Rosa Symphony. Matt and I are both recording engineers, and we had the idea to use this season to introduce the kids to the wonderful art of recording. That was the original idea for this program, and we worked together to adapt to the changes that the pandemic threw at us. Matt has moved on to another part of the country, but we want to thank him from the bottom of our hearts for helping us bring about this project, and we really miss you, Matt. The new Matt is Elena Sloman, who is not only a fabulous oboist, but also an incredibly talented administrator, photographer, techie, and just works so well with the group. She jumped right in without hesitation and helped with nearly every aspect of this concert, including saving the concert from some major technical glitches just before we went on the air. She is working behind the scenes right now, and we could truly not have done this without her. Also, Kate Matwichik was stepped in during the few weeks between Matt leaving and Elena starting. And she also saved us right before we went on the air. So thank you, Kate. Enrique Rojas, an extremely talented jazz guitarist, an audio engineer, and a techie, helped me engineer the audio for the recording, and he did all of the video editing of the music, which is an extremely difficult job. Hollywood has these huge teams of people that do all the aligning of the video and the audio fragments. So he had hundreds of them to line up, and he did a beautiful job. Enrique, we could not have done this without you. Wendy Silman, our Director of Education, who you heard at the beginning, thank you for steering the ship so beautifully, always believing us in the value of YPCO, and keeping the music activities and education going throughout this entire year when it would have been easier to just put everything on hold. Ben Taylor, our Director of Development, who used to have Wendy's job, believed so strongly in our education programs, supported the Redwood Violin project right away when I first brought it to Santa Rosa Symphony. And he also found us a seasoned sponsor, Gregory Sprain. Thank you, Gregory. We could not have done this without you. Thank you, Andy, for entrusting us with the premiere of the Redwood Violin. And the audience members, if you came to us through the Redwood Violin, thank you for joining us. If you haven't yet checked out his website, there's just an amazing amount of video about this wonderful community project. Thank you, Diane Peterson from the Press Democrat, who wrote 2 beautiful articles that brought together and into focus the Redwood Violin project and our concert tonight. If you're here because of one of those articles, you have Diane to thank. Thank you, Francesco, for believing in us, for bringing your incredible energy and musicianship to us, and for making the time to record the Martinez with us, and for being such a wonderful role model for everyone. And finally, thank you, our dear audience, for being here on Zoom with us while we share some music that none of us knew before this past season, myself included. We hope that you have been enjoying getting to know it as much as we have. And actually, that shouldn't have been finally. Finally, thank you to YPCO and to your families who have been so supportive during this difficult time. Even during normal times, it is very challenging to support a musician through learning an instrument and developing a level of mastery and learning how to play in an ensemble like this. So thank you all for sticking with it and being such an important part of our community. And that's all. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the show.